Chapter 22, A Warm Wind. And so Wilbur came home to his beloved manure pile in the barn cellar. His was a strange homecoming. Around his neck he wore a medal of honor. In his mouth he held a sack of spider's eggs. There's no place like home, Wilbur thought, as he placed Charlotte's 514 unborn children carefully in a safe corner. The barn smelled good. His friends, the sheep and the geese, were glad to have him back. The geese gave him a noisy welcome. Congratulations, they cried. Nice work. Mr. Zuckerman took the medal from Wilbur's neck and hung it on a nail over the pig pen where visitors could examine it. Wilbur himself took a look at it whenever he wanted. In the days that followed, he was very happy. He grew to a great size. He no longer worried about being killed, for he knew that Mr. Zuckerman would keep him as long as he lived. Wilbur often thought of Charlotte. A few strands of her old web still hung in the doorway. Every day Wilbur would stand and look at the torn, empty web, and a lump would come to his throat. No one had ever had such a friend, so affectionate, so loyal, or so skillful. The autumn days grew shorter. Lurvy brought the squashes and pumpkins from the garden and piled them on the barn door where they wouldn't get nipped on frosty nights. The maples and the birches turned bright colors, and the wind shook them, and they dropped their leaves one by one to the ground. Under the wild apple trees in the pasture, the little apples lay thick on the ground, and the sheep gnawed on them, and the geese gnawed them, and the foxes came in the night and sniffed them. One evening, just before Christmas, snow began to fall. It covered the house and the barns and the fields and the woods. Wilbur had never seen snow before. When morning came, he went out and plowed the drifts with his yard for just the fun of it. Fern and Avery arrived dragging a sled. They coasted down the lane and out onto the frozen pond to the pasture. Coasting is the most fun there is, said Avery. The most fun there is, retorted Fern, is when the Ferris wheel stops and Henry and I are in the top car and Henry makes the car swing and we can see for miles and miles and miles. Goodness, are you still thinking about that Ferris wheel? Said Avery in disgust. The fair was weeks and weeks ago. I think about it all the time, said Fern. After Christmas, the thermometer dropped to 10 below zero. Cold settled on the world. The pasture was bleak and frozen. The cows stayed in the barn all the time now, except for sunny mornings when they went out and stood in the barnyard in the lee of the straw pile. The sheep stayed near the barn, too, for the protection. When they were thirsty, they ate snow. The geese hung around the barnyard the way boys hang around the drugstore, and Mr. Zuckerman fed them corn and turnips to keep them cheerful. Many, many thanks, they said when they saw the food coming. Templeton moved indoors when winter came. His ratty home under the pig trough was too chilly, so he fixed himself a cozy nest in the barn behind the grain bin. He lined it with bits of dirty newspapers and rags, and whatever he found a trinket or a keepsake he carried it home and he stored it there too. He continued to visit Wilbur 3 times a day, exactly at mealtime, and Wilbur kept the promise that he made. Wilbur let the rat eat first. Then when Templeton couldn't hold another mouthful, Wilbur would eat. As a result of overeating, Templeton grew bigger and fatter than any other rat you ever saw. He was gigantic. He was as big as a young woodchuck. The old sheep spoke to him about his size one day. You will live longer, said the sheep, if you eat less. Who wants to live forever? Sneered the rat. I'm naturally a heavy eater, and I get untold satisfaction from the pleasures of a feast. He patted his stomach, grinning at the sheep, and crept upstairs to lie down. All winter, Wilbur reached and watched over Charlotte's egg sack as though he were guarding his own children. He scooped out a special place in the manure for the sack next to the board fence. On very cold nights, he lay so that his breath would warm it. For Wilbur, nothing in life was so important as this small round object. Nothing else mattered. Patiently, he waited till the end of winter and the coming of little spiders. Life is always a rich and steady time when you are waiting for something to hatch or happen. The winter ended at last. I heard the frogs today, said the old sheep one evening. Listen, you can hear 'em now. Wilbur stood still and cocked his ears. From the pond in shrill chorus came the voices of hundreds of little frogs. Springtime, said the old sheep thoughtfully. Another spring. And as she walked away, Wilbur saw a new lamb following her. It was only a few hours old. The snows melted and ran away. The streams and ditches bubbled and chattered with rushing water. A sparrow with a streaky breast arrived and sang. The light strengthened. The mornings became sooner, and almost every morning there was a new lamb in the sheepfold. The goose were sitting on eggs. The sky seemed wider, and warm wind blew. The last remaining strands of Charlotte's old web floated away and vanished. One fine sunny morning after breakfast, Wilbur stood watching his precious sack. He wasn't thinking of anything much. As he stood there, he noticed something move. He stepped closer and stared. A tiny spider crawled from the sack, no bigger than the head of a pin or a grain of sand. Its body was gray with a black stripe underneath. Its legs were gray and tan. It looked just like Charlotte. Wilbur trembled all over when he saw it. The little spider waved at him. Then Wilbur looked more closely. Two little more spiders crawled out and waved, and they climbed around and around the sack, exploring the world. Then 3 more spiders, then 8, then 10. Charlotte's children were here at last. "Hello there," he said. The first spider said hello, but its voice was so small that Wilbur couldn't even hear it. "I am an old friend of your mother's," said Wilbur. "I am glad to see you. Are you all right? Is everything all right?" The little spiders waved their forelegs at him. Wilbur could see by the way that they acted that they were glad to see him. "Is there anything that you need? Anything I can get for you?" The young spiders just waved. For several days and nights they crawled here and there, up and down about, waving at Wilbur, trailing tiny drag lines behind them and exploring their home. There were dozens and dozens of them. Wilbur couldn't count them, but he knew that he had a great number of friends. They grew quite rapidly. Soon each was as big as a BB shot. They made tiny webs near the sack. Then came a quiet morning when Mr. Zuckerman opened the door on the north side. A warm draft of rising air blew softly into the barn cellar. The air smelled of damp earth, spruce woods, and sweet springtime. The baby spiders felt the warm updraft. One spider climbed to the top of the fence. Then it did something that came as a surprise to Wilbur. The spider stood on its head, pointed its spinnerets in the air, and let loose a cloud of fine silk. The silk formed a balloon. As Wilbur watched, the spider let go of the fence and rose into the air. "Goodbye," it said as it sailed through the doorway. "Wait a minute," yelled Wilbur. "Where do you think you're going?" But the spider was already out of sight. Then another baby spider crawled up to the top of the fence, stood on its head, made a balloon, and sailed away. And then another, and then another. The air was soon filled with tiny balloons, each one carrying a spider. Wilbur was frantic. Charlotte's babies were disappearing at a great rate. "Come back, children," he cried. "Goodbye," they called. "Goodbye, goodbye." At last one spider took enough time to stop and talk to Wilbur before making its balloon. "We're leaving here on the warm updraft. This is the moment for setting forth. We're aeronauts, and we're going to the world to make webs for ourselves." "But where?" asked Wilbur. "Wherever the wind takes us, high, low, near, far, east, west, north, south. We take to the breeze and we go as we please." "Are all of you going?" asked Wilbur. "You can't all go. I would be left alone with no friends. Your mother would not want that to happen, I'm sure." The air was so full of balloonists now that the barn cellar looked as though a mist had gathered. Balloons by the dozen were rising, circling, and drifting, away through the door, sailing off in the gentle wind. Cries of "Goodbye, goodbye, goodbye" came to Wilbur's ears. He couldn't bear to watch any more. In sorrow he sank to the ground and closed his eyes. This seemed like the end of the world, to be deserted by Charlotte's children. Wilbur cried himself to sleep. When he woke, it was late afternoon. He looked at the egg sack. It was empty. He looked in the air. The balloonists were gone. And then he walked wearily to the doorway where Charlotte's web used to be. He was standing there thinking of her when he heard a very small voice. "Salutations," it said. "I'm up here." "So am I," said another voice. "So am I," said a third voice. "3 of us are staying. We like this place. We like you." Wilbur looked up. At the top of the doorway, 3 small webs were constructed, and each web was busily working one of Charlotte's daughters. "Can I take this to mean," asked Wilbur, "that you've definitely decided to live here in the barn cellar and that we are going to be friends?" "You can indeed," said the spider. "What are your names, please?" said Wilbur, who was trembling with joy. "I'll tell you my name," replied the first little spider, "if you tell me why you're trembling." "I'm trembling with joy," said Wilbur. "Then my name is Joy," said the first spider. "What was my mother's middle initial?" asked the second spider. "A," said Wilbur. "Then my name is Urania," said the spider. "How about me?" said the third spider. "Will you just pick a sensible name for me? Something not too long, not too fancy, and not too dumb?" Wilbur thought hard. "Nellie," he suggested. Fine, I like that very much, said the third spider. You may call me Nellie. She daintily fastened her orb line to the next spoke of the web. Wilbur's heart brimmed with happiness. He felt that he should make a short speech on this very important occasion. Joy, Urania, Nellie, he began, welcome to the barn cellar. You have chosen a hollowed doorway from which to string your webs. I think it's only fair to tell you that I was devoted to your mother. I owe my very life to her. She was beautiful, brilliant, and loyal to the end. I shall always treasure her memory. To you, her daughters, I pledge my friendship forever and ever. I pledge mine, said Joy. I do too, said Urania. And so do I, said Nellie, who had just managed to catch a small gnat. It was a happy day for Wilbur, and many more tranquil, happy days followed. As time went on and the months and years came and went, he was never without friends. Fern did not come regularly to the barn anymore. She was growing up and very careful to avoid childish things like sitting on a milk stool near a pig pen, but Charlotte's children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren year after year lived in the doorway. Each spring there were new little spiders hatching out to take place of the old. Most of them sailed away on their balloons, but always 2 or 3 stayed and set up housekeeping in the doorway. Mr. Zuckerman took fine care of Wilbur all the rest of his days, and the pig was often visited by friends and admirers, for no one ever forgot the year of his triumph and miracle of the web. Life in the barn was very good. Night, day, winter, summer, spring, and fall, dull days and bright days. It was the best place to be, thought Wilbur, this warm, delicious cellar, with garrulous geese, the changing seasons, the heat of the sun, the passage of swallows, the nearness of rats, the sameness of sheep, the love of spiders, the smell of manure, and the glory of everything. Wilbur never forgot Charlotte. Although he loved her children and grandchildren dearly, none of the spiders quite ever took her place in his heart. She was in a class by herself. It is not often that someone comes along who is a true friend and a good writer. Charlotte was both. The end.